1963 becomes almost like a glimmering image from the past, particularly for today's students. While the benchmark of November 1963 is meaningful to someone over the age of 40, very meaningful, brings out a lot of memories, good and bad. To students today, 18 and 19-year-olds, 1963, unfortunately, well, they weren't born. So to them, much of what they know, if they know anything at all about Kennedy and the Kennedy legacy, has been gleaned from movies and TV miniseries, and unfortunately many of those movies and television series being not necessarily historically accurate. So in terms of how most educators teaching high school students today deal with the Kennedy legacy, we try to look at it from a present perspective, but also keeping in mind that this man was assassinated towards the end of his term. There was a lot of myth-making and hero manufacturing, so to speak, that went on. All of that has to be taken in context, and you also have to keep in mind the, for lack of better terms, the cottage industry and Kennedy debunking, if you want to call it that has occurred in the last 20 or so years. So educators, for the most part, it could be seen as a minefield, so to speak, or it could be seen as very rich for a lot of research, a lot of critical analysis. And I tend to look upon it as basically the latter. Towards the mid-60s, I would think that optimism and that sort of quest, if you will, for a charismatic leader who will lead us out of the forest, I think manifested itself first a little bit in Pearson, who was seen as the internationalist, who had new ideas about a new world order and so on. And then certainly very much so on Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was seen as our Canadian equivalent of Kennedy.
Pearson had provided us with a vision of our own, not quite as intensive, not quite as emotional as the Kennedy vision. But, I mean, we're not Americans, and he wasn't our president. And we had a great sense of admiration and fondness for him to some extent, but he wasn't one of ours. And I think that tempered our own reaction. I'm not saying that it wasn't strong, but it wasn't like, I mean, people weren't crying in the streets when Kennedy was assassinated, and they certainly were in the U.S.
He used television to his advantage and things, and a lot of the politicians have to do that now. Like they have, a lot of them, like all of them, I think, have like makeup people, and they have to look really well when they speak and things. And Kennedy, started sort of that. Like he looked good on television, and people that heard the debates on radio thought that Nixon had won debates, but then when they saw the television, they were for Kennedy because he was better looking, and he looked so well, and so people liked him. And I think politicians have learned that today, just the way, because when you see them, it's always planned. Like they always, when they're going to talk, it's all planned out, and they know where they're going to stand, and the cameras are all set up.
I think they're facing a crisis today because they don't have anyone they can seize upon. Now, one could argue that Clinton is a Kennedyistic, if there is such a word, figure, and probably for a lot of Americans he is. Now, whether or not he will live up to the expectations that the Americans have obviously put upon him remains to be seen. It's too early in his term to know, although the popular press, the honeymoon, if you will, is already over. And he's already being attacked for his promises that he's just not keeping, and his hairstyle. I mean, all the stuff that we hear about with American presidents today. Like Americans won't let their celebrities die. For example, in talking to some individuals earlier today, we were talking about posters that appear in classrooms and students' rooms and whatnot. Favorite posters now: Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, Marlon Brando, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and so on, most of whom have died at an early age, usually tragically, but have remained very much alive. And of course, I forgot Elvis Presley, who can be seen at your local supermarket. Now, I think Kennedy can be put in the same vein. Okay, Americans just won't allow him to die. They don't want him to die. And I think they've come to the realization that, yes, he's dead and buried in the ground under, some would call mysterious circumstances, but he's dead, very much dead. But he's still very much alive in their psyche, and they're still looking for someone to take his place. The American influence has certainly not waned. If anything, with NAFTA and so on, it's increased. And I think Canadians, looking upon the Americans having elected Clinton, a young, charismatic leader, or at least one who's perceived as being charismatic and young, now we have a chance of, if you will, electing our first female prime minister sometime in the fall. Perhaps Canadians, the aftermath of the Clinton election will spill over, and perhaps we'll say, hey, let's take a chance.
I believe it comes from our colonial background, because our English ancestors, which we are in general from, and our Francophone people too, they don't lionize their leaders as much. And since the Americans defeated the English in their revolution, they've tried to get away from the English point of view. So they build up their leaders, they build up their heroes. And if you look at our Canadian fathers of Confederation, none of them were backwoodsmen. They were lawyers, and nobody likes a lawyer. And so we don't feel the need to raise these people as martyrs and as saints and as heroes. Jim Campbell represents a charismatic, younger face, a different face, like what could be our first woman prime minister. And I think that would be a great accomplishment. And that might give her the edge against John Chrétien, who is an older, more conservative, well, even though he leads the Liberal Party, he's an older person for the older generation. And that's why I imagine he will probably get elected, because that generation is in the majority right now. But I think Kim Campbell will get a lot of votes from the younger people, just because it's a new face, just as John Kennedy was.
I don't think that we look for a Clinton figure in Canada. I mean, Kim Campbell's about far away from Clinton as they get.
She smoked pot,
though. Oh, yeah, she did now. Yeah. I don't know, because she's, even though she's a Tory, but she's done some pretty interesting things, as opposed to Clinton, who, even though there was a few scandals in the election campaign, he was pretty clean, and that was the thing, they couldn't get anything on him.
When I began teaching in 1970, and I saw idealism there, but it was kind of a passive idealism. Rather than we can make changes, it's we're going to try to cope with the way things are and make things as nice as we can. So there's this kind of acceptance of the fact that there are forces that can't be changed, or the upheaval that would be required to change them isn't worth it. And I guess if there were one word I could use to characterize young people nowadays, it's resignation. That we just have to find out what the rules are and play by those rules. Whereas in the time of Gene McCarthy and Kennedy, it was, we're going to make new rules that are better for everybody. I don't see that anymore.
We seem to have come full circle in the course of 30 years of geopolitical upheaval. Once again, the American people have turned to a young president to guide them out of a period of complacency and inertia. And Canadians have followed suit by seeking a more vibrant prime minister to represent them on the world stage. Will the young people who look forward to the opportunities of the 21st century respond to their challenge? Will they ask, as we did in the Kennedy era, what they can do for their country? Or will they succumb to cynicism and apathy? Many politicians in the 90s would like to see themselves as heirs of the Kennedy legacy, but their lack of courage and compassion impedes their progress. The New World Order is still an elusive dream. We continue to teeter on the brink, despite the end of the Cold War. Who will our young people look to for inspiration? Who will challenge them to get involved? Those of us who remember the Kennedy era realize that we were fortunate indeed. For once, history found the right man and at the right time.